In the dense, suffocating swamplands of southern Louisiana, where Spanish moss hangs from ancient cypress trees like funeral shrouds, and the air is thick with the scent of decay and forgotten things, lies a ruin that the locals speak of only in hushed, fearful whispers. For over a century, the skeletal remains of the Vandegrift Institute for Wayward Youth and the Afflicted have been slowly swallowed by the unforgiving marsh, its story relegated to the shadows of folklore. But in the spring of 1978, a team of land surveyors, hacking their way through the overgrown property, stumbled upon a secret that would claw its way out of the mud and into the stark, horrifying light of day. Just beyond the crumbling foundation of what was once the Institute's infirmary, they found a series of shallow, unmarked depressions in the earth. It was a makeshift cemetery, a potter's field of the damned. Forensic investigation would later confirm the presence of over 200 bodies, a silent congregation of men, women, and children whose lives had been erased from history. Official records, many of them sealed for decades and only recently made public, tell a sanitized story of a philanthropic family, the Vandegrifts, who dedicated their lives to sheltering the destitute. But the discovery of the graves and the chilling artifacts found within the Institute's decaying walls challenges everything we thought we knew about one of the Gilded Age's most celebrated families. This is not a story of charity, but of chilling cruelty, not of sanctuary, but of a systematic enterprise of horror that operated for nearly 40 years, hidden in plain sight. It is a story that has been deliberately buried, a dark chapter in American history that powerful people hoped would remain forgotten, lost to the swamp forever. This channel is not for everyone. We delve into the shadows, into the uncomfortable truths that history prefers to hide. If you are one of the brave souls who believes that the darkness must be brought to light, then you have found your community. Subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, as we join together to uncover these lost stories. The tale of the Vandegrift family is one of the most disturbing we have ever encountered, a testament to the fact that the most monstrous acts are often committed by those who wear the mask of virtue. The family was a triumvirate of power, a perfectly balanced machine of public charisma, methodical cruelty, and ruthless efficiency. At its head was the Reverend Alistair Vandegrift, the charismatic leader and the public face of the dynasty. A man blessed with a thunderous voice and eyes that seemed to peer directly into the souls of his parishioners. Alistair was a titan of the pulpit, a celebrated orator whose sermons on compassion and redemption were printed in papers across the country. He moved through high society with an air of unshakable authority, his name synonymous with piety and benevolence. He was the one who charmed the philanthropists, who swayed the politicians, and who convinced desperate families that the Vandegrift Institute was a haven, a place of healing and salvation sent by God himself. But behind the righteous facade, behind the carefully crafted image of a modern-day saint, lay a profound and chilling darkness, a void of empathy that allowed him to preside over an empire of suffering without a flicker of remorse. His words were a hypnotic balm, soothing the fears of the outside world while ensnaring the vulnerable within his web. Beside Alistair stood his younger brother, Dr. Elias Vandegrift, the methodical specialist and the twisted genius who gave the family's dark enterprise its purpose. While Alistair commanded the souls of his followers, Elias commanded their bodies. A brilliant physician and researcher educated at the finest institutions in Europe, Elias was a man of science, a cold and detached observer of the human condition. He presented himself to the world as a pioneer in the burgeoning fields of eugenics and mental hygiene, publishing papers that argued for the scientific management of society's unfit elements. The Institute was his living laboratory, a place where he could pursue his grotesque experiments far from the prying eyes of academic oversight. He was the architect of the treatments, the designer of the arcane medical devices, the silent figure in the white coat who moved through the wards with a notebook and a needle. His work, he claimed, was for the betterment of humanity, a necessary, if sometimes unpleasant, step in perfecting the human race. He was the how-to expert, the one who transformed the family's greed and cruelty into a twisted scientific crusade. He was rarely seen in public, a phantom who haunted the halls of the Institute, his presence more terrifying to the inmates than that of his commanding brother. It was Elias who signed the death certificates, citing consumption, cholera, or nervous exhaustion. And it was Elias whose meticulous, nightmarish journals, discovered decades later, would provide the most damning evidence of the true nature of the Vandegrift family's work, detailing his experiments with a chilling, scientific detachment that bordered on the inhuman. Completing the triumvirate was the formidable matriarch, Eleanor Vandegrift, Alastair and Elias's older sister. If Alastair was the voice and Elias was the mind, Eleanor was the iron will that held the entire operation together. She was a practical enforcer, the logistical manager who handled the Institute's finances, security, and day-to-day operations. While her brothers concerned themselves with ideology and experimentation, Eleanor concerned herself with the grim realities of their criminal enterprise. She was a woman of severe appearance and even more severe temperament, a grounded and ruthless pragmatist who ensured the Institute ran with the clockwork precision of a factory. She managed the supply chains, ensuring a steady flow of everything from foodstuffs to chloroform and morphine. She hired and fired the staff, selecting for loyalty and a willingness to turn a blind eye. She controlled the money, laundering the donations of wealthy benefactors into a personal fortune, while allocating just enough to maintain the Institute's barely habitable conditions. It was Eleanor who dealt with nosy inspectors, who silenced disgruntled employees, and who managed the delicate business of making people disappear from official records. She possessed none of Alastair's charm or Elias's intellectual pretensions. Her power was more primal, rooted in fear and absolute control. She was the gatekeeper, the one who decided who was admitted and, more importantly, who was never allowed to leave. Together, the three Vandegrift siblings formed a corrupt and impenetrable collective, a self-contained unit of evil, each playing their part to perfection, their shared secrets binding them together in a conspiracy of blood and silence that would endure for decades. The Vandegrift Institute for Wayward Youth and the Afflicted was established in 1895 on a sprawling 1,000-acre plot of land deep within the Louisiana wetlands, a location chosen for its isolation. The official narrative, propagated by Reverend Alastair in countless fundraising galas, was that the remote setting offered a therapeutic escape from the squalor and vice of the cities, a place where the corrupted air of urban life could not reach. The truth, however, was far more sinister. The swamp was a natural fortress, its impenetrable terrain and malarial reputation a deterrent to visitors and a formidable barrier to escape. The main building itself was a monument to Gothic foreboding, a sprawling 3-story structure of dark brick and stone that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Its architecture was a jarring mix of institutional severity and ecclesiastical grandeur. Tall, arched windows, meant to evoke a cathedral, were fitted with thick iron bars. The central tower, which housed Alastair's private study, resembled a prison watchtower more than a church steeple. The grounds were meticulously manicured near the entrance, a perfect picture of order for the rare visitor. But this curated beauty quickly gave way to the wild, untamed swamp that pressed in from all sides. The Institute was designed to be a paradox, a place that looked like a sanctuary from a distance, but felt like a penitentiary from within. Its very design was a form of psychological warfare. The long, echoing hallways were painted a sterile clinical white, the floors scrubbed so aggressively with lye that the scent hung permanently in the air, burning the nostrils. The dormitories were Spartan, filled with rows of iron cots packed so tightly together that there was barely room to walk between them. Every aspect of the environment was engineered for control and subjugation, from the heavy, locking doors to the windows that were sealed shut, even in the suffocating heat of the Louisiana summer. The daily routine within the Institute was a masterpiece of oppressive discipline, orchestrated by Eleanor and enforced by a staff of hand-picked orderlies. The days were governed by the ringing of a loud, clanging bell that dictated every moment of the inmates' lives. Wake up was at dawn, followed by a breakfast of thin, watery gruel and stale bread. From there, the wayward youth were sent to labor in the Institute's laundry or vast vegetable gardens, their small bodies toiling for hours under the blistering sun. The afflicted adults, those deemed too sick or mentally unstable for physical labor, were confined to the infirmary ward, a place of hushed terror presided over by Dr. Elias Vandegrift. Here they were subjected to his treatments, which ranged from endless days of forced bed rest in isolation rooms to more invasive procedures involving electroshock therapy, hydrotherapy in ice-cold water, and the liberal administration of powerful sedatives that left them in a state of perpetual stupor. Communication with the outside world was strictly forbidden. All incoming and outgoing mail was censored by Eleanor herself, with most letters simply being incinerated. Any attempt to question the authority of the staff or the Vandegrifts was met with swift and brutal punishment. The methods were varied but equally cruel. Solitary confinement in a dark, unventilated cell in the basement known as the Quiet Room, public whippings administered by the orderlies, or a visit to Dr. Elias's infirmary for a special treatment that would leave the dissenter docile and compliant for weeks. The inmates were the most vulnerable members of society. Orphan children, penniless immigrants, unwed mothers cast out by their families, and the mentally ill who had no one to advocate for them. They were society's forgotten, their vulnerability the very reason they were chosen. Their stories were lost, their identities systematically erased by the Vandegrift machine, their suffering the dark, secret fuel that powered the family's empire. For years, the Vandegrift Institute operated with impunity, its reputation burnished by the constant praise of a duped public and a compliant press. The family was a pillar of the community, their power and influence extending into the highest echelons of state politics and finance. To question the Vandegrifts was to question the very foundations of social order and Christian charity. But in the autumn of 1907, the first hairline crack appeared in their impenetrable facade. It began with the disappearance of a 17-year-old girl named Sarah Jenkins. Sarah was not an orphan or a vagrant. She came from a respectable, albeit poor, farming family in a neighboring parish. After a bout of what the local doctor called female hysteria following a failed romance, her desperate parents were persuaded by their local minister, a devotee of Reverend Alistair, to commit her to the Vandegrift Institute for a period of rest and moral correction. Her parents received 2 letters in the first month, both written in a strange, stilted hand, assuring them that she was settling in well and responding to the calm and spiritual guidance of the Institute. Then, the letters stopped. After 2 months of silence, her worried father made the arduous journey to the Institute to visit his daughter. He was met at the gate by Eleanor Vandegrift herself. With a display of practiced sympathy, Eleanor informed him that Sarah, in a fit of melancholic despair, had run away from the Institute weeks ago, disappearing into the vast, unforgiving swamp. She presented the grieving father with a signed affidavit from Dr. Elias, attesting to the girl's unstable mental state, and a note, supposedly in Sarah's handwriting, professing her desire to end her own life. The local sheriff, a man indebted to the Vandegrifts for a generous campaign donation, conducted a cursory search of the swamp's edge and officially declared Sarah Jenkins a tragic victim of suicide, her body likely lost forever to the marsh. The case was officially closed, but not everyone was satisfied. The parish's new sheriff, a young and stubborn man named Thomas Brodie, who had been elected on a reform platform, was troubled by the inconsistencies in the story. He was a skeptical outsider, a man immune to the Vandegrift charm, and he found the family's explanations to be too neat, too rehearsed. In his private journal, Brodie noted his suspicions. "Met with the Vandegrift woman today," he wrote. "She speaks of a lost girl with a cold detachment of a banker discussing a defaulted loan. And the doctor, he did not meet my eye once. He spoke of hereditary weakness and moral contagion, as if the girl were a disease, not a daughter." Brodie attempted to launch a more thorough investigation, but he was immediately met with a wall of resistance. The previous sheriff's report was immaculate. The coroner, a man who sat on the board of one of Reverend Alistair's charities, had already signed off on the cause of death. When Brodie tried to question the staff at the Institute, he was politely but firmly denied access by Eleanor, who cited patient privacy and the delicate sensibilities of her other wards. His superiors in the state capital, men who attended the same social clubs as Alistair Vandegrift, warned him to let the matter rest, cautioning him that harassing a family of such impeccable standing could be detrimental to his career. The message was clear. The Vandegrifts were untouchable. The disappearance of Sarah Jenkins was officially a tragedy, but for Sheriff Brody, it was the first sign of a deep and terrifying rot, the first glimpse into the darkness that the family guarded so fiercely behind their walls of brick and piety. He was forced to abandon the case, but the mystery of what truly happened to the girl would linger in his mind. A persistent, gnawing suspicion that he was standing on the edge of an abyss. The system of control perfected by the Vandegrifts was a masterclass in psychological manipulation and social engineering, a trinity of powers that ensured their dark secrets remained buried. At the forefront was Reverend Alistair's dominion over the public mind. His power was not merely in his sermons, but in his ability to weave a narrative so compelling that it became reality for most people. He understood the deep-seated fears of the Gilded Age, the fear of social decay, of moral collapse, of the unseen elements corrupting the nation's bloodline. He played upon these anxieties with the skill of a virtuoso. In his speeches, he would paint a vivid picture of a society on the brink of chaos, and then he would offer the solution. Institutions like his, bastions of order and moral hygiene, guided by Christian principle and scientific rigor. He declared the Institute a moral quarantine, a place where the contagion of poverty and vice could be contained and studied. This narrative was incredibly effective. It not only attracted enormous donations from wealthy industrialists who saw themselves as partners in this grand project of social purification, but it also provided a powerful justification for the Institute's extreme secrecy and harsh methods. When stories of hardship occasionally leaked out, Alistair would masterfully reframe them. A starving inmate was not a victim of neglect, but a soul being taught the virtue of asceticism. A person broken by torture was not a victim of cruelty, but a sinner whose stubborn pride was being cleansed. He made the public complicit in his cruelty by convincing them it was a necessary, even noble, act. He transformed a prison into a sanctuary in the public imagination, a feat of rhetorical alchemy that protected the family for decades. If Alistair controlled the outside world, Dr. Elias held absolute power within the Institute's walls. His authority rooted in the quasi-religious reverence for science and medicine that was blooming at the turn of the century. In an era before strict medical ethics and oversight, the doctor was a figure of immense, almost unquestionable power. Elias exploited this to its fullest extent. He was the sole arbiter of reality for the inmates. He decided who was sane and who was insane, who was sick and who was well. His diagnoses were not medical, but political. An inmate who showed signs of rebellion was diagnosed with oppositional defiant mania and subjected to electroshock treatments. A young woman who resisted the advances of an orderly was diagnosed with erotomania and placed in prolonged hydrotherapy. These treatments, described in his journals with chilling precision, were not designed to heal. They were designed to break the human spirit. They were instruments of torture disguised as medicine. Elias's greatest weapon was the medicalization of dissent. By labeling his victims as mentally or morally defective, he stripped them of their credibility. Who would believe the ravings of a diagnosed hysteric over the considered opinion of a respected physician? This tactic was devastatingly effective. It isolated the inmates, making them doubt their own perceptions of reality. It also created a perfect shield against any external scrutiny. Any complaint could be dismissed as a symptom of the very illness the Institute was supposedly treating. Elias perverted the language of healing, turning it into a vocabulary of oppression. He created a closed system where he was the only source of truth, a medical god in his own private hell. His diagnoses the final, unappealable judgment on the lives and sanity of those trapped within his care. The final, crucial element of the Vandegrifts' control was the ruthless, pragmatic management of Eleanor. While her brothers built the ideological and scientific justifications for their work, Eleanor built the physical and financial fortress that protected it. She was the architect of the Institute's isolation. She understood that power came not just from ideas, but from logistics, money, and intimidation. Her first principle was controlling the flow of information. She personally screened every new employee, using her keen judgment of character to select for individuals who were either deeply loyal, deeply compromised, or simply lacked the curiosity to ask questions. Those who showed signs of dissent were summarily fired and, if necessary, intimidated into silence with threats to their reputation or their families. Her financial acumen was equally vital. She managed a complex web of shell corporations and opaque charitable trusts, a financial labyrinth that made it nearly impossible to track the vast sums of money flowing into the Vandegrift coffers. Donations meant for new blankets or better food for the inmates were funneled into private investment portfolios or used to bribe public officials. Her account books, which were seized during the later investigation, appeared immaculate, a testament to her meticulous deception. Eleanor was also the master of the bureaucratic firewall. She created a mountain of paperwork for every inmate, a file thick with forged doctor's notes, falsified psychological evaluations, and signed confessions to fabricated transgressions. This bureaucratic nightmare served a dual purpose. It gave the Institute the appearance of a professional, well-documented organization, and it provided the perfect cover for making inmates disappear. With a few strokes of a pen, Eleanor could transfer a person to a non-existent sister institution in another state, or more commonly, have Dr. Elias sign a death certificate for a John Doe who would then be buried in the unmarked graves behind the infirmary. She was the silent partner, the unseen force, whose cold, calculating efficiency made the entire horrific enterprise possible. Despite the Vandegrift's formidable control, the truth has a way of seeping through the cracks. For 20 years, whispers and rumors had swirled around the Institute like the swamp mist, intangible yet persistent. Locals who hunted in the surrounding wetlands spoke of strange lights burning late into the night in the infirmary wing. The fishermen on the bayou told tales of hearing what sounded like muffled screams carried on the wind, sounds that they attributed to the strange birds of the swamp or the cries of the mentally disturbed. There were stories from delivery men who dropped off supplies at the Institute's gates, noting the unusually large orders of chloroform, morphine, and other powerful drugs, far more than what a typical infirmary would require. They also noted the gaunt, haunted look in the eyes of the few inmates they were allowed to see, working in the fields under the watchful gaze of grim-faced orderlies. These stories were mostly dismissed as local folklore, the kind of ghost stories that naturally attach themselves to any large, isolated institution. The power of the Vandegrift name was such that it could rationalize away almost any suspicion. The screams were merely the sounds of the hysterical being treated. The large drug orders were for Dr. Elias's groundbreaking research. But for Sheriff Thomas Brody, these scattered whispers were pieces of a puzzle he couldn't let go of. He meticulously documented every rumor, every piece of gossip, no matter how outlandish, in his private journal, searching for a pattern. The official story was that the Institute was a place of quiet contemplation and healing, but the anecdotal evidence painted a picture of something far more sinister, a place of noise, of pain, of secrets. The turning point came in the winter of 1927, nearly 20 years after the disappearance of Sarah Jenkins. A young boy, fishing for crawdads in a creek miles downstream from the Institute, found a small, corked bottle washed up on the muddy bank. Inside, protected from the water, was a tightly rolled piece of paper. It was a letter, written in a desperate, spidery script. The letter was unsigned, its author identifying themselves only as one of the forgotten. It spoke of horrors that defied belief. "They call it a hospital," the letter began, "but it is a butcher shop. The doctor uses us for his experiments. He calls it curing the sickness in our blood. People go to his infirmary and do not come back. We are starving. We are beaten. Alistair preaches of God's love, while his sister counts the money and his brother plays with our lives. There are bones in the field behind the sick house. God forgive us all." The boy gave the letter to his father, who, fearing the power of the Vandegrifts, was hesitant to act. But the story of the bottled message spread through the small, rural community, reawakening old fears and suspicions. Eventually, the letter found its way into the hands of Sheriff Brody. For Brody, this letter was the piece of concrete evidence he had been waiting 2 decades for. It was a voice from inside the fortress, a confirmation of his darkest suspicions. The letter was dangerous. To act on the unverified claims of an anonymous author against the most powerful family in the state was a career-ending, if not life-ending, risk. But holding the fragile piece of paper, Brody knew he could no longer stand by. The whispers had finally solidified into a scream for help. He now held in his hand a testament from the vulnerable, a message from the heart of the darkness, and he was determined to follow it, no matter where it led. If you find this story as important as we do, if you believe that these voices deserve to be heard, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone you know. It helps our channel immensely and ensures that these forgotten histories reach a wider audience. By subscribing, you become part of a community dedicated to ensuring that the darkness of the past is never allowed to be forgotten. Now, let us return to the charismatic monster at the center of this web, Reverend Alistair Vandegrift. To understand how the Institute survived for so long, one must understand the almost supernatural power of Alistair's charisma. He was not just a preacher. He was a public relations genius in an age before the term existed. He understood the power of performance, and every sermon, every public appearance, was a carefully staged masterpiece. His physical presence was captivating. He was tall and immaculately dressed, with a mane of silver hair and eyes of a startling, intense blue. His voice was his greatest instrument, capable of a thundering condemnation of sin one moment and a soft, hypnotic whisper of redemption the next. He rarely spoke of the specifics of the Institute. Instead, he spoke in grand, sweeping allegories. He would compare the Institute to a lighthouse, guiding the lost ships of humanity away from the rocks of despair. He would describe its residents as fallen sparrows being cared for by the hand of the Lord, a narrative that was both poetic and emotionally manipulative. One famous incident illustrates his mastery. A state legislator, prompted by a handful of concerned constituents, publicly questioned the Institute's high mortality rate. The story began to gain traction in the New Orleans papers. Alistair responded not with defensiveness, but with a public sermon, delivered at the city's largest cathedral. In that sermon, a transcript of which still exists, Alistair never once mentioned the legislator or the mortality rates. Instead, he spoke for an hour on the story of Job. He painted a heartbreaking picture of suffering and loss, of faith tested by inexplicable tragedy. He spoke of the sacred mystery of suffering and the divine wisdom in calling a soul home. He concluded by saying, "There are those in this world who see a field of crosses and see only failure. They count the bodies, but they do not weigh the souls. I tell you, when one of our flock, one of our broken sparrows, is called to God's embrace, it is not a tragedy, it is a triumph. It is a soul, purified by trial, finally granted its peace. We do not mourn their passing from our care. We celebrate their arrival in His." The effect was electric. The audience was moved to tears. The newspapers, the next day, ran headlines like, "Reverend Vandegrift eloquently defends his sacred mission." The legislator who had raised the initial concerns was cast as a callous, cynical bean counter, a man incapable of understanding the profound spiritual work being done by the Vandegrifts. Alistair had not answered the question. He had rendered the question blasphemous. He made any inquiry into the practical failings of the Institute seem like a spiritual failing on the part of the inquirer. He had an almost magical ability to control the narrative, to shape perception, and to make people feel that by supporting him, they were on the side of the angels, even as he presided over a literal hell on earth. This was the nature of his evil. It was an evil that cloaked itself in the language of love, an evil that convinced the world it was a form of grace. While Alistair charmed the world with his words, his brother Elias engaged in a far more tangible form of evil within the sterile confines of his infirmary. Dr. Elias Vandegrift was a true believer in the dark and twisted ideology of the eugenics movement, a pseudoscience that was gaining a frightening legitimacy in the early 20th century. He saw the poor, the mentally ill, and the socially undesirable not as people to be helped, but as genetic liabilities to be managed, studied, and ultimately eliminated. The Institute provided him with a perfect, unregulated environment to put his theories into practice. His private journals, seized during the eventual raid, are perhaps the most horrifying documents in the entire case file. They are filled not with emotional outbursts or confessions of guilt, but with page after page of cold, detached, scientific observation. He wrote about his victims as if they were laboratory rats. Subject 73. One entry reads, referring to a young Irish immigrant woman committed for melancholia, displays remarkable resistance to hypnotic suggestion. Will increase dosage of sodium bromide solution and observe effects on cognitive coherence. Her resilience is a testament to the stubbornness of the defective Celtic strain. He documented his experiments in excruciating detail. He tested the limits of human endurance to pain, starvation, and psychological distress, all under the guise of research. He developed a treatment he called cerebral purification, which involved drilling a small hole into the patient's skull to relieve the pressure of corrupting humors, a primitive and often fatal lobotomy that he performed with crude, hand-cranked instruments. He experimented with non-consensual sterilization, believing he was doing humanity a service by preventing his victims from passing on their inferior genes. The infirmary was his kingdom of horrors. It was a place kept antiseptically clean, yet filled with the stench of chemical reagents and human misery. Surviving testimony from one of the few inmates who was eventually freed speaks of Dr. Elias as a silent, ghost-like figure. He never raised his voice, the survivor stated in a deposition. He would walk through the ward and he wouldn't look at you like a person. He would look at your chart. He would touch your arm, but it wasn't a comforting touch. It was like a farmer checking his livestock. The worst part was the quiet. The screaming you could get used to. But the quiet when he was there, that was the sound of real fear. Elias's work was the secret purpose of the entire Vandegrift enterprise. Alistair's preaching and Eleanor's management were all in service to providing Elias with a steady supply of human subjects for his grotesque research. He was not a sadist in the traditional sense. He took no apparent pleasure in the suffering he caused. For him, it was simply the work. This detachment is what makes him, for many, the most terrifying of the Vandegrift siblings. He was not driven by passion or greed, but by a chillingly rational, deeply held belief in his own righteousness. He was a man who had so thoroughly dehumanized his victims in his own mind that their pain was no more significant to him than the data it produced. He was the methodical monster, the man in the white coat who turned human beings into footnotes in his private, nightmarish ledger of pseudoscientific depravity. The engine that powered this entire machine of death and deception was Eleanor Vandegrift. If her brothers represented the public and private faces of the Institute's ideology, Eleanor was its grim, functional skeleton. She was the master of the mundane details of evil, the one who made the abstract horrors conceived by her brothers a practical reality. Her domain was the Institute's administrative office, a dark, wood-paneled room from which she commanded every logistical aspect of their criminal enterprise. Her genius was for organization. She created a system so efficient and so thoroughly documented with false information that it was virtually impenetrable from the outside. Her primary task was to maintain the illusion of a functioning, legitimate institution. This meant managing the books. She was a brilliant, if corrupt, accountant. For every dollar donated for the welfare of the inmates, she could show a receipt, a purchase order, a record of expenditure. The receipts, however, were often for vastly inflated prices, paid to supply companies that were secretly owned by the Vandegrift family through a series of shell corporations. The food that was purchased was the cheapest, lowest-grade feed available, barely fit for livestock. The medicine was often expired or diluted. The new blankets and warm clothing that appeared in her ledgers existed only on paper. The profits from this systematic fraud were immense, funneled into Swiss bank accounts and real estate investments, building a vast, hidden fortune for the family. Eleanor's ruthlessness was most apparent in how she dealt with people. She cultivated a network of informants among the staff, rewarding loyalty with small privileges and punishing any hint of insubordination with immediate and permanent dismissal. She was known to use blackmail and intimidation to ensure the silence of former employees. A former orderly who had threatened to go to the press about the conditions at the Institute suddenly found himself facing trumped-up charges of theft. His credibility destroyed. His case was a quiet, potent warning to anyone else who might consider crossing the Vandegrifts. But Eleanor's most critical role was in managing the Institute's population, both living and dead. She was the one who controlled intake, carefully selecting victims who had no family or social connections to speak of. And she was the one who managed their departure. When an inmate died, either at the hands of Dr. Elias or through simple neglect, Eleanor would handle the paperwork. The body would be stripped of any identifying markers. The name would be expunged from the Institute's internal records. A death certificate would be filled out by Elias, citing a common illness, but the name on the certificate would be a generic John Doe or Jane Doe. The body would then be handed over to a pair of trusted, silent groundskeepers, who would bury it in the unmarked field behind the infirmary under the cover of darkness. In the state's official records, the person had simply vanished. Through meticulous, bureaucratic cruelty, Eleanor Vandegrift performed a kind of magic trick. She made people disappear not just from the Institute, but from history itself. She was the enforcer, the keeper of the gates and the books, the woman whose cold, pragmatic evil provided the foundation upon which her brother's more theatrical horrors were built. Armed with the anonymous letter found in the bottle, Sheriff Thomas Brody knew he could no longer rely on official channels. For 20 years, he had been a lone voice of skepticism, his concerns dismissed, and his career subtly thwarted at every turn by the Vandegrifts' immense influence. Now he decided to launch his own clandestine investigation, operating in the shadows, knowing that discovery would mean his ruin. He began by re-examining the Institute's public records, but this time he looked not for what was there, but for what was missing. He cross-referenced the state's census data with the Institute's published annual reports. He found dozens of discrepancies, individuals who were recorded as entering the Institute but were never recorded as leaving, and who subsequently vanished from all other public records. They were ghosts in the machine, their existence erased by Eleanor's meticulous paperwork. Brody's investigation took on a new urgency. He started spending his nights poring over the county's financial records, painstakingly tracking the supply orders to the Vandegrift Institute. He confirmed the old rumors, the massive, wildly disproportionate purchases of sedatives, anesthetics, and chemical restraints. He also discovered payments to a number of medical supply companies he had never heard of. With quiet, patient digging, he discovered that these companies were little more than post office boxes, their ownership traced back through a dizzying maze of holding companies that ultimately led to a law firm in New Orleans known for its discreet dealings with the city's elite, a firm where Eleanor Vandegrift was a silent partner. The Institute wasn't just neglecting its patients. It was using them as part of a massive, sophisticated financial fraud. The sheriff knew he needed more. He needed a witness. He began discreetly reaching out to former employees of the Institute, men and women who were now scattered across the state. Most refused to speak with him, their fear of the Vandegrifts still palpable even years later. But he finally found one, an elderly woman who had worked as a laundress at the Institute in the 1910s. At first she denied everything, but Brody's quiet persistence and his genuine concern finally broke through her wall of fear. In a hushed, trembling voice, she told him what she had seen. She spoke of the children, their bodies covered in bruises and sores. She spoke of the constant, low moaning that came from the infirmary ward, a sound the staff was forbidden to acknowledge. And she told him about the laundry. The sheets, she whispered, her eyes wide with ancient terror. The sheets from the doctor's ward. They were always stained with so much blood. Not just a little. So much. We were told not to ask. We were told to just burn them in the incinerator. This testimony, while not enough to secure a warrant on its own, was the first human voice to corroborate the claims in the bottled letter. It transformed the investigation from a matter of financial ledgers and missing persons into a tale of real, tangible suffering. Brody now had the outlines of the horror. He had the financial motive, the pattern of disappearances, and a witness to the brutal reality of life within the institute. He was no longer just a skeptical sheriff. He was the uncoverer of a truth so dark and monstrous that he himself was beginning to have trouble comprehending its scale. He knew his next move would be his last, one way or another. He had to get inside those walls. The tipping point, the event that finally blew the lid off the Vandegrift's fortress of secrecy, came not from Sheriff Brody's investigation, but from an act of desperate courage from within the Institute itself. In the spring of 1928, a young man named Daniel, who had been committed to the Institute as a teenager for incorrigible behavior, managed to do the impossible. He escaped. For years, Daniel had been a model inmate on the surface, quiet and compliant, learning the routines of the Institute, the patterns of the guards, the blind spots in its security. He had endured the beatings, the starvation, and a treatment from Dr. Elias that had left him with a permanent tremor in his hands. But he had never allowed his spirit to be broken. He waited for his moment. During a violent thunderstorm that knocked out the Institute's newly installed electric generator, plunging the grounds into chaos and darkness, Daniel made his move. He slipped away from his dormitory, scaled a perimeter wall during a flash of lightning, and ran into the treacherous, snake-infested swamp. For 2 days, he struggled through the mire, fueled by adrenaline and a desperate will to live. He was bitten by a cottonmouth and ravaged by fever, but he kept moving, driven by the need to tell someone, to make the world believe what was happening in that terrible place. He finally collapsed on the outskirts of a small fishing village, where he was found, delirious and near death, by a local trapper. He was brought to the parish's small charity clinic, and when he was finally able to speak, he began to tell his story. The local doctor, thinking him mad, called the sheriff's office to report a vagrant. The call was taken by Sheriff Thomas Brody. When Brody arrived and saw the young man, emaciated, feverish, and branded with the distinctive VI mark on his forearm, he knew this was the breakthrough he had been praying for. Daniel's story was a torrent of horrors, a first-hand account that confirmed every one of Brody's suspicions and went far beyond them. He spoke of the starvation, the torture, the medical experiments. He named names, described rooms, and pinpointed the location of the unmarked graveyard behind the infirmary. "They don't all die from the doctor," Daniel rasped, his voice raw with pain and exhaustion. Sometimes the Reverend takes the young ones, the pretty ones, to his study in the tower. They scream, and then they're just gone." This new, explosive testimony, the mention of Reverend Alastair's direct involvement in the abuse, gave Brody what he needed. He now had a living victim, a credible witness who could testify in court. He worked quickly, knowing the Vandegrifts would soon learn of the escape and use their immense power to silence Daniel and discredit him. He took a detailed, sworn deposition from the young man, had his injuries photographed, and in a bold and career-risking move, placed Daniel in protective custody in a secret location. With Daniel's harrowing testimony added to his own extensive investigation, Sheriff Brody went before a sympathetic circuit judge, a man from outside the Vandegrift sphere of influence, and laid out his case. On the morning of April 12, 1928, the unthinkable happened. The judge, horrified by the evidence presented, signed a comprehensive search warrant for the entire Vandegrift Institute property. The slow-burn investigation was over. The raid was about to begin, and the secrets of the Vandegrift family were about to be dragged, kicking and screaming, into the light of day. The raid on the Vandegrift Institute began at dawn. Sheriff Brody, accompanied by a dozen hand-picked deputies and a state medical examiner, descended on the isolated property. They were met at the gates by an indignant Eleanor Vandegrift, who demanded to know the meaning of the intrusion, her voice dripping with cold fury. When presented with the search warrant, her composure momentarily cracked, a flicker of panic in her steel-gray eyes. The deputies fanned out across the grounds, their grim task beginning. What they found within those walls would forever be seared into their memories, a tableau of human cruelty, so profound it defied comprehension. The dormitories were as bad as expected, filthy, overcrowded, and filled with the stench of sickness and despair. The inmates, at first terrified and suspicious, slowly began to realize that these men were not new orderlies. A few, emboldened by the presence of the law, began to whisper of the horrors they had endured. But the true heart of darkness was, as Daniel had said, in Dr. Elias's infirmary and Reverend Alastair's tower study. The infirmary was a scene from a nightmare. In a locked ward in the basement, they found a dozen people in restraints, emaciated and covered in sores, their eyes vacant from years of sedation. In Elias's private laboratory, they discovered his collection of medical oddities. Jars containing preserved human organs, detailed anatomical drawings of his victims, and his surgical instruments, including the crude, hand-cranked drill he used for his cerebral purifications. They also found his journals, the cold, meticulous records of his crimes. As one deputy later testified, with his voice breaking, "We entered that room a hospital, but it was a torture chamber. The things we saw, no man should have to see." The discoveries in Alastair's private study were of a different, but equally depraved, nature. Behind a false bookcase, they found a small soundproof room. The room was sparsely furnished, containing only a small cot and a camera on a tripod. The walls were covered with dozens of photographs, images of the young boys and girls Daniel had spoken of, their eyes wide with terror. Alastair Vandegrift, the man of God, the paragon of virtue, had been using his position to prey on the most vulnerable children under his care, his crimes hidden away in his private tower. The final and most damning discovery was outside. Guided by Daniel's directions, Brody led his men to the field behind the infirmary. They began to dig. Within minutes, they found the first body, then another and another. It was a mass grave, a haphazard cemetery of the forgotten, their bodies wrapped in burlap sacks and buried just a few feet beneath the soil. The scale of the killing was staggering. The medical examiner, a hardened veteran of his profession, was seen weeping openly. The raid lasted for 2 days. By the end, the full, monstrous scope of the Vandegrift family's operation was laid bare. It was not just an institution of neglect and fraud. It was a factory of death, a place of systematic torture, sexual abuse, and murder, all presided over by a family that the world had revered as saints. The news of the discoveries exploded across the state and the nation. The Vandegrift name, once a symbol of charity, was now a byword for unimaginable evil. The illusion, so carefully crafted and fiercely protected for over 30 years, had been shattered forever. The arrest of Alastair Elias and Eleanor Vandegrift sent shockwaves through American society. The public, who had for so long idolized the family, reacted with a mixture of disbelief, denial, and ultimately furious outrage. The story dominated newspaper headlines for months, each new revelation from the investigation more horrifying than the last. The trial, held a year later, was a national spectacle. The prosecution, led by Firebrand Attorney General, methodically laid out the case, presenting the evidence found during the raid, Elias's journals, the photographs from Alastair's study, Eleanor's fraudulent account books, and the harrowing testimony of the few survivors brave enough to speak, including Daniel, the escaped inmate whose courage had broken the case open. The defense strategies of the three siblings were as distinct as their personalities. Alastair Vandegrift, ever the performer, mounted a theatrical defense. He claimed he was the victim of a vast conspiracy, a plot by his political enemies and atheistic forces to destroy his good name. He delivered impassioned, sermon-like speeches from the witness stand, weeping as he professed his love for the unfortunate souls in his care, denying any knowledge of the horrors uncovered. He was, to the very end, the charismatic leader, attempting to charm and manipulate the jury. Elias, in stark contrast, was cold, detached, and unrepentant. He admitted to his experiments, but he refused to call them crimes. In his chilling testimony, he described his work in detail, defending it as a necessary scientific endeavor for the advancement of the race. He spoke of his victims as specimens and data points, showing no remorse, only frustration that his important research had been interrupted. His testimony, more than any other piece of evidence, sealed the family's fate, revealing the monstrous ideology that lay at the heart of their enterprise. Eleanor Vandegrift, the pragmatic enforcer, remained silent throughout the trial. She refused to take a stand, her face an unreadable mask of stone. She listened to the evidence against her, to the tales of her financial deceptions and her ruthless intimidation tactics, without a single flicker of emotion. Her silence was its own kind of testimony. The cold, calculating silence of a manager who had been caught, a conspirator who refused to give her accusers the satisfaction of an explanation or an apology. The verdict was never truly in doubt. After weeks of testimony, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on all counts for all three siblings. The charges ranged from fraud and kidnapping to torture and first-degree murder. Alistair, the beloved preacher, collapsed into sobs upon hearing the verdict, his performance finally failing him. Elias simply nodded, as if accepting an expected, if inconvenient, outcome. Eleanor stared straight ahead, her expression unchanged. All three were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The Vandegrift empire had fallen. The trial had exposed their evil to the world, but the question of justice for their hundreds of unknown victims, buried in the Louisiana mud, remained a haunting, unanswered question. The legal proceedings were over, but the dark legacy of what they had done was only just beginning to be understood. In the years following the trial, the Vandegrift Institute for Wayward Youth and the Afflicted was shut down, its remaining inmates transferred to state-run facilities. The property itself was seized by the state, but no one knew what to do with it. It was a place so thoroughly tainted by its history that it was deemed unsalvageable. The buildings were left to decay, to be slowly reclaimed by the swamp, becoming the source of local ghost stories and a grim warning to future generations. The land itself was consecrated, but the unmarked graves were never fully exhumed, the cost and difficulty of identifying the remains deemed prohibitive. The 200 souls discovered by the surveyors in 1978 represent only a fraction of those believed to be buried there, their names and stories lost forever. The fates of the survivors were varied and often tragic. Many were too psychologically scarred to ever lead normal lives, spending the rest of their days in and out of mental institutions, their trauma dismissed by a world that was eager to forget the horrors they had endured. Daniel, the brave escapee, lived a quiet life, forever haunted by his experiences. He never fully recovered from the physical and emotional wounds inflicted upon him, but his testimony was instrumental in ensuring the Vandegrifts could never harm anyone again. For decades, the story of the Vandegrift family faded from the national consciousness. It was an uncomfortable, shameful chapter, and many of the powerful families and institutions that had supported the Vandegrifts had a vested interest in seeing it buried. The official histories were rewritten, the family's philanthropy once again emphasized, their crimes reduced to a footnote, an aberration. It was only the discovery of the mass grave in 1978, a story that eerily echoed the climactic revelation of the 1928 investigation, that brought the full horror of the Vandegrift legacy back into the public eye. The discovery proved that the whispers and legends were true, that the scale of the killing was even greater than the original trial had revealed. It forced a new generation to confront the uncomfortable truth that for nearly 40 years, a factory of death had operated in America, hidden in plain sight, protected by a veil of charisma, the authority of science, and the cold efficiency of ruthless management. The macabre history of the Vandegrift family serves as a chilling and enduring cautionary tale. It is a story about the terrifying power of unchecked authority and the profound vulnerability of those who live on the margins of society. It reveals how the most monstrous acts can be hidden behind the most respectable facades, how the language of compassion, faith, and progress can be twisted to justify unimaginable cruelty. The Vandegrifts were not simple criminals. They were a product of their time, a dark reflection of the dangerous ideologies and social prejudices of the Gilded Age. Their story forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. How many other such institutions existed, their secrets still buried? How often do we, even today, allow charisma and power to blind us to the truth? And what is our collective responsibility to the forgotten victims of history, to the nameless, faceless individuals whose stories have been deliberately erased. The tale of Alistair, Elias, and Eleanor Vandegrift is a stark reminder that evil is not always a shadowy, external force. Sometimes it is found in the corner office, in the laboratory, and on the pulpit. It wears a suit, a doctor's coat, and a clerical collar. And its greatest triumph is convincing us that it does not exist. Thank you for joining us on this journey into one of the darkest chapters of our hidden history. If you believe these stories must be told, please subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video. In the comments below, let us know what you think. What is the most unsettling aspect of the Vandegrift story for you? By continuing this conversation, we honor the memory of the forgotten and ensure that their voices are finally, after a century of silence, heard.